Welcome to the Women Fantasy Authors YouTube channel. I'm Janet Hanger, and my guest today is Robyn Dabney, author of The Ascetiture. Good morning. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank
I,
you.
I discovered you and your book on social media, and I was immediately drawn to it because it includes rock climbing, which I'm interested in, and I thought that that was an unusual subject for a fantasy novel. Let me start off by reading the excerpt from the review from Publishers Weekly. High stakes and cinematic world building anchor Dabney's immersive debut. Rich storytelling, layers, lyrical prose, feminist themes, and touches of magic against Ektar's political unrest and Clark's ambiguous origins, building to an open-ended conclusion. That's an ambitious story with a lot of moving parts. And politics is a major piece. So I wanted to ask, did current events inspire some of the storyline?
Certainly. So I actually started writing this book back in 2017. So current and past events, I would say. I did finish this book in 2018, revised it, and we finally sold it in 2022. But I feel like the current events right now are obviously just this tale from everything we've been living through. So yes, definitely our times have played into this. As you said, that there's a lot of pieces to this. So it is The Ascetiture is book one of a trilogy, the Daughter of the Summit and Sea series. So it will take me more than one book. It'll take me 3 books to tell this whole complicated story. And you can absolutely bet that book 2 has been influenced by the things over the past year.
Mm.
I'm currently writing book 3. And so, yeah, it's going to be interesting how everything happening in the world right now plays into what I end up writing and how I end up concluding this story.
Certainly, that makes a lot of sense. Wow. And we'll see what happens. And I'm happy there's going to be a couple of more books. Because you're so detailed in your climbing, I know that you have climbing experience. So what is your personal rock climbing and mountaineering experience, and how did that inform your story writing?
Sure. So I grew up in the outdoors. My dad was with the National Park Service. I lived in southern Utah, did a lot of mountain biking and hiking and camping, a little bit of climbing, but it really wasn't until about 2011 I climbed my first mountain, and that was Mount Rainier in Washington State. My dad had been a park ranger at Rainier in the 70s, and I'd grown up hearing these crazy stories of him pulling bodies off the mountain or rescuing
Mhm.
people, and as a little girl, to me, I was one of those little girls that heard that stuff and I was like, well, that sounds like something I'd like to do. So we climbed this mountain in 2011, and it was the absolute hardest thing I ever did.
Mm.
um, and then a couple years later started rock climbing, but it wasn't until about 2020 that I actually really got into rock climbing more seriously. So I kind of started out more in the mountaineering, kind of hiking in the mountains type thing, and then got into rock climbing. But it was definitely inspired by my family, by my past growing up in the outdoors. Um, and I also loved fantasy. I'm a fantasy writer. And so I kind of had this idea at one point that I wanted to take these two things I love, fantasy and climbing, and combine them together. We don't often see extreme sports as sort of the big plot thread for a fantasy novel. And I thought that would be a really kind of cool and unusual way to tell this revolution women's rights story as well.
Yeah, it works really well, and it really adds a lot to the story. We'll talk a little bit that more a little bit later. Your main character, Clark, loves to climb and has dreams of becoming an ascenditure, which is one of the king's special climbing, part of the king's special climbing squad. Who are these climbers, and what is their assigned task for the king?
So the Ascenditors are this team of climbers who have a couple different tasks, I guess 3 different tasks. One is they sort of act as these celebrities. There's the celebrities of this kingdom. They're the people folks look up to and want to be. But their functional tasks are, one, they do a lot of complicated repairs. So they have to climb towers on the castles or rappel down bridges or fix dams to get to these places where other folks can't get to. And their third and kind of biggest task that they do specifically for the king is they climb this peak called Fitzon. It's in the Mitre Backbone, which is kind of this mountain ridge just outside of the main city. And at the top of this mountain are, one, a special food called a solan, which is kind of a fancy potato that is reserved just for the king and his family to eat. We do not necessarily know all of the roles of this food, but we know that it is just used for the king and his family. And they also gather a medicine up there. It's the only cure for a disease called pulmonosis, which affects a lot of the people of this kingdom. They work in tar factories, glue
Mm.
factories. This kind of area was inspired by, let's say, Industrial Revolution London. And so this is the only cure for that. And so they go up there to procure this food and this medicine.
Right. And I'm looking forward to the mystery about the special food being revealed in a later book, because obviously there's quite a bit more going on there than we've been told so far. In relationship to the health problems and what's going on in the kingdom, Clark's living in a patriarchal society that treats women as property and relegates them to wife, mother, and menial tasks. Uh, Clark is trying to become part of this climbing team against all odds. What would it mean to Clark and society if she succeeds in becoming an ascendager?
That's a great question. Um, Clark really plays with this throughout the book because these opportunities do come to her, and she comes to this point where she has to make decisions on what she is willing to sacrifice for her dreams. Because this book does include some conspiracy, it does get a little bit dark. And so Clark really grapples with what this means and what she's willing to sacrifice for it. To her personally, she does have that piece of her that has the ego piece that would absolutely love to be the first woman to do this, to break down these barriers, to not save the world, but to kind of be this person who charges through these doors. For the society as a whole, and you do have a lot of other women in the kingdom who are cheering her for her, who are rooting for her, who are dying for her. And to them, Clark is a figurehead. At one point, there's a woman who works in the palace who tells her, like, I grew up knowing I would never be anything, and you are giving me the opportunity to basically tell my daughter that she maybe can be something someday. And so I think for the rest of the kingdom, Clark is a symbol that if she succeeds, their lives may change, or at least their children's lives may change.
Yes, and thank you for writing a story that will help our daughters and granddaughters. I mean, that's a beautiful piece.
Thank you.
For early on in the story, for reasons that aren't exactly clear, Clark does get invited to compete in a competition to fill one of the vacant spots. She competes and she's not selected. And then later in the story, she's invited again to compete on a distant mountain that has brutal climbing conditions. And the story begins to turn very dark and ominous because it appears that climbers are being murdered. They're being selected and murdered. And so the mystery darkens. Can you give us any insights without giving us spoilers about a little bit about the politics behind what might be going on with the king and his minions?
Sure. Well, I can give one piece of it away, and then the rest you have to wait for
Okay.
2 and then 3 also.
Okay.
The first piece is on the immediate scale, the king in the kingdom during this time, you start having these revolutions happen where women are angry that Clark has been passed over again, even though she was the best. You start to, have people protesting. And so on one hand, the king allows her to make this climb to show that he is open to listening to them, but it's an act. And so let's say the surface piece of why these climbers start dying and why this happens is because he does want to set it up to where it looks like the gods are angry that you have a woman
Mhm.
climbing, that they are all being punished, that these young boys are dying because a woman was allowed to climb. And so he wants to, one, look like he's doing something about it, and two, make sure that people see the repercussions of what happens when you allow a woman to take a step out of line.
Right.
And then the bigger piece we'll get to in
Yes.
the
So,
coming books.
okay. But that does make it, that brings it into a little sharper focus. Certainly. She is taken under the wing of one of the senior climbers. Was it Elias? I believe.
Elias.
Elias, I'm sorry. And I'm wondering what brought she's an orphan, correct? And so what is his interest? Why did he take her under his wing?
Let's see. I want to make sure I'm giving information that is not stuff that's in my brain from the recent books. So Elias was actually her father's best friend. And so they were climbing teammates together. Clark's father was an ascendature. He did mysteriously quit at one point and went and started working as a sea captain, sailing ships to and from distant lands. But her father and Elias were best friends. And so I believe in this book, doesn't matter if it's not, there's a scene where Clark kind of has this flashback to what Elias has told her, and that was that before her father died, he had told Elias, take care of her, please. Like that, I am asking you to do that as a friend. So he's almost, you could think of it as a godfather in
Okay.
that sort of role. And so he did pay money to help her stay out of having to work in a factory, to have to go work at a brothel to pay for her tenements. He did bring her into climbing to train to try to get her a better life, knowing that she probably would never be able to be an ascendature, but he was kind of doing this as a favor to a friend.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, he's quite the ally throughout the story. And there's things that happen that are I won't say, but anyway, things get tough. Things get tough partway through the story. This is the thing I was most anxious to talk with you about. Uh, One of the best things about this book are the descriptions of the climbing. We're right there on the wall with Clark. We're feeling her discomfort, her struggle, the cold, and it kind of it reminded me a little bit of when I was reading Into Thin Air by John Krakauer in terms of the intensity of the scenes, especially on that ladder climbing scene. And as someone who has climbed myself, I was thinking about it takes more than muscles to get up the mountain. There's an emotional and spiritual component that's happening. It takes inner fortitude. And I wanted to hear about your take about not only the inner journey for Clark, but the inner journey for you. How is that for you as a climber? And how does that relate to Clark and the story?
Yeah, I loved writing those pieces too. And it's especially when you have background in a topic like climbing and you're a writer, it's really important to write them in a way that other climbers can read it and be like, yes, this tracks, but other people aren't just absolutely overwhelmed by technical
Mhm.
jargon. So that was just a fun balance to try to strike. It also was great because it gave me an opportunity to pull in actual things I've experienced. I mean, I have not experienced the things Clark experienced, but for instance, on that climb up Mount Rainier, a lot of those things Clark experiences on Mount Bonin or in other places where it's hard to breathe or she's cold or it's isolating or it's scary or somebody falls, are all things I experienced and are very interesting, as you said, internal things that you experience as a person. So to be able to share that on the page uh, was cathartic for me in a way, but also just fun to I fully believe when you're writing about a book, you mentioned Into Thin Air, and you have something natural like a mountain, like an earthquake, that setting can absolutely become a character. It can become an
Absolutely.
antagonist or a friend or and I really wanted this to feel like the mountain or the rock face, whatever natural element she was interacting with was its own character. I wanted to give it its own life because I feel that also when I'm climbing, not just when I'm writing. When I'm out on a rock and I'm climbing, it's me. As you said, it's spiritual. It's me. It's the rock. It's the wall. The only thing that keeps me safe, besides my belayer, who is wonderful, is my own skill, my own ability to make decisions, strength somewhat, my mind, my desire to persevere. And it was really cool marrying those two things, writing and trying to set out to write a character, setting as a character, um, and taking these very intensive personal experiences of climbing or doing something physical and putting those together.
You did it beautifully. You did it
Thank
beautifully. It
you.
was, it was gripping. I read some of your reviews online, and people were saying I couldn't put it down. This is very true, and it's partly because of the climbing scenes. I think, And if you're not a climber or have no experience, it doesn't matter because she does a beautiful job in walking you through it, and you'll be in the story, and it'll be intriguing and compelling. So I want you all to
Thank
get a
you.
copy and read it. So that was, yeah, uh, great. When I first started climbing, it was actually mostly I've done indoor climbing in a gym, and my belayer and I were just a couple of random people that met at a workshop, and we are best friends now. There's something about
Cool.
somebody having their life in your hands, or your life in their hands, I should say. So there's a real bond that happens between your climbing mates too. And we see some of that happening in the story. Not all of the Ascendager climbers are against her being successful. She has a couple of allies. So we see some of that bond developing between these people as they're facing the challenges. I also wanted to ask, what was your favorite part about writing Clark's character?
Let's see. I really loved getting to express some of my own feelings or frustrations or experiences through her journey. I always worked in pretty traditionally male dominated fields. I worked
Mhm.
as a park ranger, I worked as a firefighter, I worked as a outdoor adventure guide. Um, and I did not experience anything to the level Clark did, but there were always these um, moments of sexism or misogyny, or I had to work twice as hard for something. And so I had all of that kind of built up in me. And so writing this story was a way to put it into a story, which is such a healing and healthy way to deal with things you're dealing with.
Yeah.
And there's a particular scene on top of Mount Bonin, kind of in the very middle of the book. I believe it's in chapter 12, where I feel like the essence of the book comes out, and that's where Clark is up on this mountain with another man who tells her he finally accepts her because she's basically a man. And so you
Yes.
have this scene where she's like, I am not basically a man. If I was basically a man, I wouldn't be here trying to prove myself. And that's my favorite scene of the book. So writing that was so much fun. I was so proud of Clark in that
Right.
moment. I, she did not feel like a piece of me. She felt like her own person, and I was like, I am inspired by you, kid. Like,
Yeah.
um, and I really enjoyed that. And going back to kind of what you said just a minute ago about how not all of these men hate her or are against her. I really also enjoyed writing these men in a parallel story to her, because a lot of these guys that she's with on her team are younger, and they even say we don't have those same feelings that these older guys do. When they
Yes.
die, it's going to be different. And I wanted to mirror that because I see a lot of that in our world today too. Like there's all these loud voices with these really hateful, nasty folks, but a lot of them are older, and a lot of younger people don't feel that. And I wanted to put that in the story too, because I didn't want it just to be this dark and hopeless thing. It's definitely not an anti-man story. There's a lot of
Right.
wonderful men in this story.
Sure.
Um, and they get journeys too with Clark. And I really enjoyed those journeys alongside hers.
Right. Yeah. I retired from working on a college campus, and so I got to be around all these wonderful young people, both men and women that are progressive and fighting for change. And have you, over the course of your experience, are you seeing that things are changed, especially when you go out to climbing sites now to climb?
Definitely. And there are so many women climbing now. And you
Yes.
go to a boulder gym or a climbing gym or out to a wall, and I don't know if it's 50-50, but it's close now. And I
Oh,
feel like it could even surpass that, right? That's
yeah.
happening in universities, it's happening everywhere. Now that women are allowed to do all the things, we're doing
Yeah.
the things.
You know,
Um,
yeah.
and I love that. And I've spoken to a couple of professional climbers doing some research for this and whatnot. Um, and there's definitely a difference between the older ones who kind of were in the 70s and 80s, their experiences versus the ones who are coming up in the 2000s. And it's not perfect for sure, but I think there is good change coming in that direction.
Right. I think so too. the place where I climbed was at the university where I worked. So I'm in the climbing gym with the students, and I walk in, and it's always a different student on the desk, and they'd see me coming in, and I'm not a kid, and I've got gray hair, and they'd kind of look at me, and then I'd plop my bag down, and I'd start pulling out my harness and my gear, and then they're like, oh, and then immediately any prejudice that they had would go away because they could see, oh, she's serious, she knows what she's doing. So it's interesting seeing it from an elder's perspective as well.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, let me share your screen so people can get your information if they want to take a screenshot.
Okay.
All right, that's all her information. And you've already told us that you're planning 2 more books, so it's going to be a 3-part series, at least as far as you know, right?
My contract is for 3 books.
Okay.
And I'd really love to write something new after that. So
Yeah, I know. I
I
understand.
did set up something in book 2 that would allow me in the future to write a spin-off if I want to. So I have set it up if I want to return to this world, because I do love this world. I do love climbing. Yes, the series here, it is titled The Daughter of the Summit and Sea. And book 2 will be out next December. So I even have a date
not
for
this
it.
coming, not you mean 2025?
December of 2025.
Oh, okay.
I know.
All right. Well, throw, throw us some tidbits on your email so that we can keep involved in the wonderful world that you've created.
Yes, at some point I do hope to send out chapter 1 of book 2 to my email subscriber list. So if anybody signs up for my email, I wouldn't be surprised if I do send out some sneak peek stuff so that you don't have to wait.
And I'm assuming that if they click on your webpage, there's a sign up right there on your front page. Okay, great. Yep. Great. All right, let me shut that back down. One thing I didn't mention yet, at least I don't think I did, is that there's a bit of a love interest. It seems like it's kind of a friendship, caring, and I'm hoping, are we going to see a little bit more of that as we head into story 2?
Definitely.
Okay.
Yes, that builds, and there may be other things as well. So
okay.
But yes, I do dive farther into that love interest. Somebody was asking me, I want more romance, and I was like, well, I have to stop killing people on a mountain to give them time to fall in love. So bear with me.
I'm really okay with a slow burn, and
Yeah.
I'm really okay with friends to lovers. And I like that it focused on Clark and her personal challenge without gumming it up with something more intimate beyond people caring about her and somebody expressing interest. I think it's great pacing in that regard, and I look forward to seeing how it evolves out. I have one last question for you, and it's not related to writing. I would like to know, where is your favorite place to either climb or hike in the world?
Yeah. I am incredibly biased here, but I grew up in Moab, Utah, out in the deserts of southern Utah, which is where Arches National Park, Canyonlands. For those who can't picture it, it's kind of Grand Canyon looking type red rocks and deserts. It is my favorite place on earth. It is where my soul feels the fullest. I absolutely love climbing on sandstone. There's not a rock I like better than sandstone. And so, yeah, anywhere in the Moab area, climbing to me is absolutely phenomenal. Or biking or rafting, anything outdoors. That's kind of my favorite place to be.
Yeah, I understand. I grew up going to the Sierra Nevada, and it's still my favorite place to go. I want to ask you a favor. If you have one, would you please send me a picture of you climbing wherever?
Yeah.
And then when I send this link out to the interview in my newsletter, I'll include a picture of you climbing for people to see. I'd love to see it myself, and we'll put it on there. So
perfect.
Excellent. Robyn, thank you for writing this amazing story and indulging me today in my interest and love of rock climbing and everything about the outdoors. It's been a pleasure to talk with you today, and I look forward to your upcoming novel. Thanks again, everybody. I will post her links down in the information block below the video here. Please like the button, follow me, and we look forward to having more interviews with wonderful authors like Robyn in the future. Thank you again, Robyn, for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Great. Thank you.